The Great Sphinx, known, forgotten, and known again. For much of the modern world, the Great Sphinx of Giza appears suddenly in history, a colossal face rising from the sand, a monument rediscovered, a mystery unveiled in the age of empires. But this impression is misleading. The Sphinx was not discovered in the modern era. It was remembered and forgotten and remembered again. When Napoleon Bonaparte arrived in Egypt in 1798, he did not come alone. He brought soldiers, yes, but he also brought scholars, engineers, draftsmen, and observers. They were there to catalogue Egypt, to measure it, to explain it, and to place it neatly within the framework of known history. What they encountered at Giza did not behave as expected. At the time of Napoleon's arrival, the Sphinx was buried almost to its neck in sand. Only the head was visible, emerging from the desert like a survivor. Its body was hidden, its scale uncertain, its full form unknown. This was not unusual. The Sphinx has spent much of its existence being swallowed and revealed by the desert in cycles. Long before Napoleon, sand had buried it. Long before Napoleon, people had seen it. Some of the earliest written accounts of Egypt come from the ancient Greeks. And here, the story becomes uncomfortable. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the pyramids in extraordinary detail. He recorded measurements, construction theories, and local traditions. Yet he says nothing about the Sphinx. This silence has puzzled scholars for centuries. It does not mean the Sphinx did not exist. It suggests something more subtle, that it may have been largely buried or regarded as unimportant, or so ancient that it no longer demanded explanation. Silence, in this case, is not dismissal. It is a clue. By the Roman period, the Sphinx reappears. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, mentions a great statue near the pyramids. He describes it as an object frequently choked by sand, a monument that had to be cleared again and again. Even then, the Sphinx was not stable. It was already old, already eroding, already half lost. Centuries later, as the Islamic world rose and flourished, the Sphinx entered another phase of memory. Medieval Arab historians and travelers did not ignore it. They wrote about it. They named it. They feared it. To them, the Sphinx was known as Abu al-Hol, the father of terror. One of the most important of these chroniclers was the historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 14th and 15th centuries. He described the Sphinx as ancient and enigmatic, already damaged, already altered by human hands. Local tradition, he recorded, did not blame accident or warfare. It blamed deliberate defacement, an act of religious iconoclasm against a monument seen as pagan. Long before canons, the Sphinx had already been changed. What unites these early references is not agreement, but uncertainty. No one claims to have built the Sphinx. No text describes its construction. No inscription explains its purpose. It exists in history as something inherited, not created, seen, buried, cleared, damaged, feared, ignored, rediscovered, again and again. When Napoleon's scholars finally began to document the Sphinx in detail, they believed they were standing at the beginning of understanding. Instead, they found themselves at the end of a long chain of unanswered questions. The Sphinx did not behave like the monuments around it. It did not announce its builder. It did not conform to expected proportions. And it did not sit comfortably within the established timeline. Even as its body was slowly freed from the sand, certainty did not emerge. Doubt did. The Great Sphinx of Giza does not confront us with a single mystery. It confronts us with a pattern of disappearance and return, of memory without explanation, of survival without context. It has been known for millennia, and yet it has never been fully understood. The deeper we look, the more the timeline begins to blur. What appears at first to be a monument of dynastic Egypt may belong to a much longer and far more complicated human story. One that stretches backward beyond kings and inscriptions, into a time remembered only in fragments, myths, and stone. And the Sphinx, patient and silent, remains exactly where it has always been, watching the horizon as questions gather around it. The most striking thing about the Great Sphinx of Giza is not its size or its age or even its silence. It is the absence, the missing nose. For centuries, this damage has invited speculation, storytelling, and myth. One of the most popular explanations claims that the Sphinx's nose was destroyed by cannon fire. During Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, it is an appealing story, clear, dramatic, and wrong. Drawings made decades before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt already show the Sphinx without its nose. By the time European armies arrived, the damage had long been done. The question is not when the nose was lost. It is why. Stone does not fail uniformly. The limestone used to carve the Sphinx is not equally fragile in all directions. Natural erosion tends to soften edges, round corners, and reduce detail gradually. What we see on the Sphinx's face does not behave like natural weathering. The nose did not fade away. It was removed. There are no tool marks that tell a simple story. No clear record of the act. No inscription explaining the damage. But there are accounts. And they come not from Europe, but from the medieval Islamic world. Centuries before modern archaeology, Egypt was already a land layered with memory. Muslim historians, travelers and scholars walked among monuments they knew were ancient, even by their own standards. They did not see the Sphinx as a curiosity. They saw it as a presence. a remnant of something old, powerful, and potentially dangerous. To medieval Egyptians, the Sphinx was known as Abu al-Hol, the father of terror. This was not a poetic nickname. It reflected genuine unease. The Sphinx was believed to possess influence, to guard the land, to watch over the desert, and to represent a past that did not align comfortably with monotheistic belief. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 14th and 15th centuries. Al-Makrizi described the Sphinx as ancient, enigmatic, and already damaged in his time. He recorded a local tradition that blamed the loss of the nose on an act of religious iconoclasm. According to this account, a Sufi Muslim named Muhammad Saim al-Dar was said to have defaced the statue in the 14th century, angered by what he viewed as continued veneration of a pagan image. Whether this specific story is entirely accurate is still debated, but the motive is revealing. The Sphinx was not damaged accidentally. It was damaged deliberately. This was not an isolated act. Across Egypt and the wider ancient world, monuments associated with pre-Islamic belief were often defaced, altered, or dismantled. Faces were removed. Eyes were gouged out. Symbols were erased. The goal was not destruction, but neutralization, to remove the power of the image by destroying its identity. The nose of the Sphinx was not merely decorative. In ancient Egyptian belief, the face was the seat of identity. To damage it was to disrupt the spirit. To remove the nose was to symbolically cut off breath, life, and presence. This was not vandalism. It was theology. And yet, even this explanation does not fully satisfy, because the damage to the Sphinx does not stop at the nose. The beard was broken off. The uraeus, the royal cobra, is missing. The face shows signs of reworking. Later traditions remembered this act, not as a triumph, but as a warning. In some accounts, the defacement of the Sphinx was followed by misfortune, not as a supernatural curse, but as a sign that the monument was not easily touched. Whether these stories reflect real consequences, or simply the unease of those who lived alongside the Sphinx, they reveal something important. The Sphinx was never treated as ordinary stone. Even those who sought to neutralize it did not attempt to erase it completely. They damaged what they believed carried identity and left the rest intact, as if the monument itself demanded limits. The Sphinx we see today is not exactly the Sphinx that was first carved. It has been altered, restored, and reshaped across centuries, which raises a deeper question. If the Sphinx was important enough to be feared, defaced, and repeatedly altered, then it was important long after its original builders were forgotten. That kind of longevity is rare. Most monuments lose relevance when the culture that built them disappears. The Sphinx did not. It remained a presence, a problem, a reminder The missing face of the Sphinx is not just physical damage. It is a symbol. A reminder that history is not only written by builders, but by those who inherit what they leave behind. Each generation that encountered the Sphinx responded to it differently. Some ignored it. Some feared it. Some tried to erase it. None fully understood it. And still, despite defacement, despite neglect, despite centuries buried in sand, the Sphinx endured. Its body remained. Its gaze remained. And the questions it raised did not fade with its features. Because the more we look at what was removed, the more we are forced to confront what remains. And what remains does not behave like a monument meant to be easily explained. Long before the Sphinx became a subject of archaeology, it was something else entirely. It was a guardian. In the ancient world, sphinxes were not decorations. They were thresholds. They marked the boundary between what was known and what was forbidden. In Greek mythology, the Sphinx was not a monument. It was a creature that tested understanding. It did not explain itself. It asked a question, and the answer mattered. The most famous riddle attributed to a sphinx appears simple at first. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer was not an animal, or a god, or a monster. It was a human being, a child, crawling, an adult, walking upright, an elder, leaning on a staff. The riddle was not about movement. It was about time, about transformation, about the passage of life, about change that cannot be avoided. Those who failed to recognize themselves in the answer were not ready to proceed. This idea of the Sphinx as a tester of awareness did not begin with Greece. It emerged there, but its roots are older. In Egypt, guardian figures were placed deliberately at tombs, at temples, at sacred pathways. They were not meant to be confronted casually. They were meant to be encountered with preparation. The Great Sphinx of Giza occupies such a position. It sits at the edge of the Giza plateau, not within the pyramids themselves, but before them. It does not guide you inside. It watches, as if marking a transition between worlds. Unlike the pyramids, which announce their purpose through scale and symmetry, the Sphinx communicates through posture. It does not move. It does not gesture. It does not explain. It observes. Its gaze is fixed toward the eastern horizon, where the sun rises each day. In ancient belief systems, the East was associated with renewal, rebirth, and order emerging from chaos. The Sphinx faces that moment, again and again. And yet, for all its symbolism, the Sphinx does not behave like a purely religious object. There are no prayers carved into its body, no dedicatory texts, no instructions for worship. It does not invite devotion. It demands interpretation. This is where the riddle deepens, because the Sphinx is neither entirely human nor entirely animal. It exists between categories: strength and intellect, instinct and reason, force and awareness. In myth, such combinations are never comfortable. They represent liminal states, points of transition, where certainty dissolves. The Great Sphinx embodies this tension physically. A massive lion's body, symbol of power, guardianship, and dominance. A human head, seat of identity, memory, and authority. Together, they suggest a being that guards not with violence, but with understanding. Not a weapon, a warning. Ancient cultures used riddles, not as games, but as filters. They separated those who memorized from those who understood. To answer a riddle was to demonstrate readiness. To fail was to reveal unpreparedness. If the Great Sphinx is a riddle, it is not one spoken aloud. It is one carved into stone. Its silence forces the observer to ask questions of themselves. Why here? Why this form? Why this scale? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why has it never clearly explained itself? Throughout history, civilizations have tried to answer these questions. Some turned the Sphinx into a symbol of royal authority. Others feared it. Some attempted to neutralize it. Others ignored it entirely. None resolved it. The riddle persisted. Unlike written riddles, the Sphinx does not punish failure immediately. It does something more subtle. It allows misunderstanding to accumulate. Each generation projects its own explanation onto the same unchanging form. Each believes it has solved the problem, and each leaves behind another layer of interpretation. This may be the Sphinx's true function, not to guard a physical passage, but to guard a threshold of understanding. A point beyond which simple explanations no longer suffice. A reminder that some knowledge is not revealed quickly or comfortably. If that is the case, then the Great Sphinx is not a relic of superstition. It is a test, one that humanity has been attempting to answer for thousands of years, and one that, so far, we may not have fully passed. For most of its existence, the Great Sphinx of Giza has not stood exposed beneath the sun. It has been buried. Not once, not briefly, but repeatedly. The image we recognize today, a massive body stretching out across the plateau, is a relatively recent one. For much of history, only the head was visible. The rest lay hidden beneath sand. The Giza Plateau is not static. It is shaped by wind, by temperature, and by time. Sand does not simply drift across the surface. It accumulates. It fills low spaces. It presses against stone. It settles into hollows. and remains there for centuries. The Sphinx, carved directly from the limestone bedrock, occupies one of those hollows. Its enclosure sits lower than the surrounding plateau, making it especially vulnerable to being swallowed by the desert. This process was not sudden. It happened gradually. Year after year, the sand crept upward. Without constant clearing, the body of the Sphinx disappeared. Only the head remained, watching as the rest of itself vanished beneath the dunes. This cycle of burial and exposure was already well established in antiquity. As early as the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, there is evidence that the Sphinx had already been cleared, restored, and reburied. Inscriptions from the reign of Thutmose IV describe the monument as partially submerged in sand. Even then, it was ancient. Even then, it required rescue. According to the dream stele placed between the Sphinx's paws, Thutmose IV fell asleep in the shadow of the buried monument. In his dream, the Sphinx promised him kingship if he would clear away the sand. Whether this story is symbolic or political, it reveals something important. By that time, the Sphinx was already struggling to remain visible. It was not a pristine monument. It was a monument fighting disappearance. The Romans encountered the same problem. By the time of Pliny the Elder, the Sphinx was once again being overtaken by sand. Pliny described it as a statue that had to be cleared repeatedly. This was not preservation. It was maintenance. Without intervention, the desert reclaimed it. Centuries later, during the medieval Islamic period, the cycle continued. Travelers and chroniclers wrote of the Sphinx as a partially buried figure, a presence rather than a structure, sometimes revered, sometimes feared, often ignored, always vulnerable. Unlike the pyramids, which rise above the plateau and resist burial, the Sphinx lies exposed. Its body stretches horizontally, offering little resistance to drifting sand. Its enclosure traps sediment. Once buried, it does not free itself. It waits. This repeated burial has consequences. Stone hidden beneath sand behaves differently from stone exposed to open air. Temperature fluctuations change. Moisture behaves differently. Erosion patterns develop unevenly. The Sphinx has not experienced time uniformly. Parts of it have spent centuries protected. Other parts have endured constant exposure. The result is a monument with a fragmented physical history. This uneven preservation complicates interpretation. When modern observers examine the Sphinx, they are not looking at a single moment in time. They are looking at layers. Some surfaces reflect deep antiquity. Others reflect later exposure. Others still reflect restoration attempts. The Sphinx is not a snapshot. It is a record. The modern image of the Sphinx, fully exposed, measured, photographed, can create the illusion of permanence. But that image is deceptive. For most of its existence, the Sphinx has existed in fragments, seen, hidden, revealed again. Each generation encountered a different version of the same monument. This matters. because it means the Sphinx has not simply survived time. It has survived neglect. It has survived misunderstanding. It has survived being forgotten. When European scholars began clearing the Sphinx in earnest during the 19th and 20th centuries, they were not uncovering a pristine relic. They were uncovering something that had been entombed repeatedly. The sand they removed represented centuries of absence, centuries during which the Sphinx was not admired, not studied, not explained, only endured. This long history of burial raises a quiet but unsettling question. If the Sphinx was meant to be seen, why does it spend so much of its existence hidden? And if it was meant to be hidden, why was it ever revealed at all? The cycles of burial and exposure do more than complicate preservation. They complicate chronology, because a monument that disappears for centuries leaves no continuous record, no uninterrupted chain of observation, no stable reference point, only gaps. Those gaps are where speculation grows, where assumptions harden, where timelines are reconstructed from fragments rather than certainty. The Sphinx invites this problem. It creates it. By the time the modern world finally exposed the Sphinx fully, it had already lived many lives. As a guardian, as a relic, as a fear, as a ruin, as a rediscovery. And still, it did not behave as expected. Because even once freed from the sand, the Sphinx does not settle into a single explanation. Its stone tells multiple stories, stories that do not always agree, stories that resist simplification. To understand the Sphinx, one must first accept this. It has not been continuously visible. It has not been continuously understood. And it has not experienced time in a single, uninterrupted way. The desert has taken it and returned it again and again. And each time it re-emerges, it brings new questions with it. By the end of the 18th century, the world was changing. Empires expanded with maps and instruments. Science demanded classification, and history began to insist on evidence rather than legend. It was during this transition that Napoleon Bonaparte arrived in Egypt. Napoleon did not come as a romantic explorer. He came as a strategist. But unlike most military commanders of his time, he brought something unusual with him. Not just soldiers, but scholars, engineers, cartographers, artists, naturalists, linguists, men whose task was not conquest, but documentation. This group became known as the savants. Their mission was to observe Egypt in detail and report it back to Europe as something measurable and knowable. Egypt was no longer to be a land of myth. It was to be catalogued. When the expedition reached Giza, the Sphinx was not unknown, but it was unresolved. Only the head emerged from the sand. The body lay hidden, its true scale uncertain. What the scholars saw immediately unsettled expectation. The pyramids made sense. They were geometric, ordered, capable of measurement. The Sphinx was different. Its proportions were difficult to reconcile, its context unclear, its damage unexplained. It did not fit neatly into the system being constructed around it. The savants began to draw it, to engrave it, to record it as it was, damaged, incomplete, ancient beyond clear explanation. These images would later appear in the monumental work, Description de l'Égypte. For the first time, the Sphinx entered the modern world not as legend, but as data. One story has persisted ever since, that Napoleon's soldiers destroyed the Sphinx's nose with cannon fire. It is dramatic, it is simple, and it is false. Drawings made before the French arrived already show the Sphinx without its nose. The damage predated Napoleon by centuries. The myth survives because it assigns blame. History is rarely that tidy. What Napoleon's expedition actually changed was not the Sphinx itself. It changed how we talk about it. From this point forward, the Sphinx would be treated as an object that must conform to a timeline, a monument that would eventually be explained once enough data was gathered. This marked the birth of modern Egyptology, and with it, a new assumption that ancient monuments belonged to specific dynasties, that their dates were fixed, and that anomalies would resolve themselves with further study. Yet even as the Sphinx was measured, sketched, and classified, it resisted closure. It lacked inscriptions. Its damage did not align cleanly with its assumed age, and its proportions raised questions no ruler's name could answer. The more precisely the Sphinx was documented, the more uncomfortable it became, because precision removes the shelter of myth. It forces contradictions into view. Napoleon did not uncover the body of the Sphinx. That would come later. But he uncovered something else, a tension between what could be measured and what could be explained. From this moment onward, the Sphinx would be bound to a modern timeline, a timeline that would shape every interpretation that followed. And once bound, any evidence that did not agree would become a problem. That problem would not appear in texts or inscriptions. It would appear in the stone itself. Stone remembers differently than stories do. It does not exaggerate. It does not forget selectively. It records what happens to it. If the Great Sphinx of Giza is older than we think, the evidence will not come from myth or memory. It will come from the stone itself. The Sphinx is carved directly from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. This is important. Unlike blocks stacked by human hands, the Sphinx's body is continuous with the ground beneath it. Whatever has happened to the plateau has happened to the Sphinx as well. Its surface is not decorative stone. It is geological record. When modern geologists and engineers began to study the Sphinx more closely, something unusual stood out. The erosion patterns on its body do not behave the way wind erosion normally does in a desert environment. Wind-driven sand tends to carve horizontally. It scours surfaces evenly. It softens edges gradually. What appears on the Sphinx's enclosure walls and lower body looks different. The erosion is vertical, rounded, flowing, as if water once ran down the stone repeatedly, rather than being blasted sideways by sand. This observation is not controversial by itself. What is controversial is the implication, because Egypt, as we know it historically, has been dry for thousands of years. Significant rainfall has not occurred there during the dynastic period. If the Sphinx shows signs of prolonged water erosion, then that erosion must predate recorded Egyptian history. Some geologists argue that these patterns could still be explained through alternative mechanisms: capillary action, groundwater, localized moisture, chemical weathering. Each explanation attempts to keep the Sphinx within the accepted timeline, but none of them fully account for the scale and consistency of the erosion observed on the body compared to the head. This discrepancy is striking. The head of the Sphinx appears far less eroded than the body. This is often explained by differences in stone quality. But it raises a question that cannot be ignored. If the body was exposed to conditions capable of carving deep vertical erosion, why was the head spared? And if the head was carved later, from harder stone, what does that say about the monument's original form? These questions gained wider attention through the work of Graham Hancock and others who argue that the Sphinx may be far older than conventional Egyptology suggests. Hancock proposes that the Sphinx could date back to a period when Egypt's climate was dramatically different, a time when the Sahara was not a desert, a time of heavy rainfall, a time before recorded history. This period is often associated with the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, a time when melting glaciers reshaped coastlines, a time remembered across cultures as a great flood. Flood myths appear worldwide, in Mesopotamia, in the Bible, in Hindu texts, in the Americas. Different cultures, different stories, a shared memory of catastrophic change. If such an event occurred, it would not leave behind neat monuments or written records. It would erase. It would scatter. It would destroy. What survived would be fragments, stone, alignment, foundation. In this context, the Sphinx becomes difficult to place. Its body appears to record prolonged exposure to water. Its enclosure walls suggest sustained rainfall rather than brief flooding. And yet, the civilization traditionally credited with building it left no direct record of its construction. This does not prove the Sphinx is 12,000 years old. It does something more subtle. It challenges certainty. It suggests that the accepted timeline may be incomplete, that the monument may have inherited damage from a climate Egypt no longer remembers. Geology does not care about dynasties. It does not care about kings. It responds only to environment. Wind leaves one signature. Water leaves another. Stone, once marked, does not easily forget. If the Sphinx's body carries the memory of water, then that memory must be explained. Either the erosion is misunderstood, or the climate history is incomplete, or the monument is older than we are comfortable admitting. This is where the debate sharpens, because to accept an older Sphinx is not simply to revise a date. It is to question the beginning of civilization itself. Mainstream archaeology tends to resist such revisions, not out of malice, but because established timelines are interdependent. Move one anchor, and others shift. Chronology becomes unstable. Certainty erodes. And yet, the stone remains, unmoved by debate, unimpressed by consensus, recording what happened to it, whether we accept it or not. The Sphinx does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not demand belief. It simply exists, with a body that appears to remember rain and a face that does not. This contradiction is not a conclusion. It is an invitation to look again, to measure more carefully, to question assumptions that feel settled only because they are familiar. If the Sphinx is older than we think, the evidence will not shout. It will whisper. In erosion lines, in softened stone, in patterns that do not align neatly with accepted history. And stone, once it has spoken, does not change its story. There is something about the Great Sphinx that feels disproportionate. Most people notice it instinctively, even if they cannot articulate why. The body is enormous, muscular, elongated. The head, by comparison, feels restrained, smaller than expected, almost cautious. This imbalance has led some researchers to ask a question that is rarely comfortable. What if the head of the Sphinx did not originally belong to the body? This idea does not come from myth. It comes from geometry. The proportions of the Sphinx are unusual. When compared to other monuments of dynastic Egypt, Egyptian statues were typically carved, with strict attention to harmony and scale. The Sphinx does not follow that pattern. Its head appears undersized, relative to the mass it commands. There is also the matter of erosion. The body of the Sphinx shows deep weathering. The enclosure walls tell a similar story. The head, however, is comparatively preserved. This is often explained by differences in stone quality. The limestone at the head is harder, more resistant. That explanation is plausible, but it does not resolve everything, because the erosion on the body is not merely deeper, it is older. Its patterns suggest long exposure to conditions that no longer exist. If the body was carved first and the head later reshaped, the discrepancy begins to make sense. Some researchers have proposed that the original head of the Sphinx may not have been human at all. It may have been a lion. This would align naturally with the body beneath it. A lion carved from bedrock, facing the rising sun. A guardian in the most literal sense. Lions held powerful symbolic meaning. In ancient cultures, they represented strength, protection, authority. In Egypt, they were often associated with solar deities and cosmic order. A massive lion carved at Giza would not have been out of place. If this were the case, then the human face we see today would represent a later intervention, a recarving, a political act. Pharaohs were not merely rulers. They were divine intermediaries. To associate oneself with an ancient monument was to inherit its authority. If a pharaoh encountered a monument older than his dynasty, reshaping it in his image, would not erase its power. It would claim it. This practice is not hypothetical. Throughout Egypt, older monuments were routinely altered. Names were replaced. Faces were reworked. Inscriptions were overwritten. History was edited, not destroyed. The Sphinx may represent the most dramatic example of this tradition. Not a monument created in one moment, but one modified across eras. A structure with a deep past and a revised identity. There are also physical clues. The facial proportions of the Sphinx do not match known statues of Khafra perfectly. Some features appear broader, others less refined. This has fueled debate about whether the face truly represents Khafra at all, or whether it was adapted to resemble him. To be clear, this does not prove the head was recarved, but it raises a problem. If the Sphinx was built during Khafra's reign, why does it behave like no other monument from that period? Why does it lack inscriptions? Why does its erosion tell a different story? Why does its scale resist expectation? These questions do not point to a single answer. They point to layers, construction, modification, restoration, reinterpretation. The Sphinx may not be a product of one culture, but a conversation between many. A monument inherited, revised, and repurposed. Each generation leaving its mark. Each believing it had solved the riddle. If the head was reshaped, it would explain more than appearance. It would explain why the Sphinx feels simultaneously ancient and familiar. Why it belongs to Egypt, yet does not fully conform to it. This idea unsettles traditional timelines, because it suggests that Egypt's great dynasties may have encountered relics from a deeper past, and rather than creating civilization from nothing, they may have built upon what remained. The Sphinx does not announce this history openly. It does not confirm recarving. It does not deny it. It simply presents a form that invites scrutiny. A massive body, a careful face, stone that remembers rain, stone that resists it, a monument that looks like it has lived more than one life. If this is true, then the Sphinx is not merely old, it is revised, and revision implies inheritance, which leads to a final, uncomfortable question. If the Sphinx was inherited, then who built the original? To question the age of the Great Sphinx is not simply to debate a monument, it is to question the timeline on which our understanding of civilization rests. Because if the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt, then it belongs to a world that official history rarely acknowledges. A world before kings, before writing, before monuments were meant to last. Human history, as it is commonly taught, begins gently. Small settlements, gradual development, slow progress toward complexity. But the geological record tells a different story, one marked by disruption. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the Earth entered a period of dramatic instability. This era is known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions. After a period of warming, temperatures dropped, climate patterns shifted, ecosystems collapsed, glaciers melted rapidly. As the planet adjusted, sea levels rose, rainfall patterns changed. Regions that are deserts today were once green, including North Africa. There is strong evidence that the Sahara was not always arid. Satellite imagery reveals ancient river systems, now buried beneath sand. Rock art depicts animals that require abundant water. Lakes once existed, where none remain. This was a world very different from the Egypt we know. If the Sphinx bears signs of prolonged rainfall, then it may belong to this earlier climate, a time when water, not sand, shaped the land. This does not require a lost super-civilization. It requires only that humans were present, earlier than we are comfortable admitting. This idea has been explored most publicly by researchers like Graham Hancock, who argue that the end of the Ice Age may have erased an earlier chapter of human development, not a global empire, but advanced knowledge, astronomy, stoneworking, surveying, the kind of understanding that leaves traces in alignment and form, even when cities are gone. Hancock points to a pattern found across cultures: flood myths, stories of destruction followed by renewal. In Mesopotamia, in the Americas, in South Asia, in ancient Egypt itself. Different languages, different gods, a shared memory of catastrophe. Mainstream archaeology does not deny that catastrophic climate events occurred. It challenges the idea that complex societies existed before them. This tension defines the debate. Not whether the Earth changed, but whether humans were capable of building monuments before history officially begins. The Great Sphinx sits directly at this fault line. If its erosion reflects heavy rainfall, then it may be older than Egypt's dynasties. If its body predates its face, then it may have been inherited by later cultures. If its alignment reflects celestial patterns from a different sky, then its builders may have lived under conditions we no longer remember. None of these possibilities are proven, but neither are they easily dismissed. The evidence does not point cleanly in one direction. It pulls. To accept a deeper age for the Sphinx is uncomfortable, It destabilizes established chronology. It suggests that civilization may not be a single upward climb, but a series of advances and collapses. Knowledge gained, knowledge lost, and fragments passed forward. In this view, the pharaohs were not the first to build greatness. They were the first to rebuild it. They inherited a landscape already marked by meaning, and they reshaped it to reflect their own time. If that is true, then the Sphinx is not a beginning. It is a survivor, a monument that endured catastrophe, neglect, and reinterpretation, not because it was protected, but because it was massive, carved into the earth itself. This perspective reframes the question. We no longer ask, when was the Sphinx built? We ask, how many times has history been reset? The younger Dryas may represent one such reset, a moment when climate changed faster than human systems could adapt, a moment when settlements vanished and memory became myth. If the Sphinx was already ancient at that time, it would have witnessed a world unrecognizable to us. Rain where there is now desert, rivers where there is now stone, and people whose stories were never written down. Stone does not remember names. It remembers forces, water, pressure, time. If the Sphinx carries those memories, then it stands as a challenge, not to belief, but to assumption. The question is no longer whether the Sphinx is old, it is how old we are willing to allow it to be. By the late 20th century, the Great Sphinx of Giza had been almost completely freed from the sand. Its body was exposed, its enclosure stabilized, its image familiar to the world. And yet, with visibility came a new question. Not how old the Sphinx was, but what lay beneath it. As technology advanced, so did curiosity. Seismology, ground-penetrating radar, subsurface imaging, tools capable of seeing through stone without touching it. When these methods were applied to the Giza Plateau, they revealed something unexpected. Anomalies. Beneath the Sphinx and its enclosure, researchers detected voids, rectangular spaces, linear features, areas where solid rock appeared to be missing. These were not decorative cavities. They were geometric, deliberate. Some were located beneath the pores, others beneath the body, others nearby, aligned with the plateau itself. The scans did not tell us what these spaces were, only that they existed. This discovery reignited old speculation that the Sphinx might guard something, not symbolically, physically. Ancient texts speak of hidden chambers, of halls of records, of knowledge preserved from an earlier age. Most scholars treat these accounts as metaphor. But the anomalies beneath the Sphinx are not metaphor. They are measurable. Attempts to investigate further have been cautious, in some cases, actively restricted. The Egyptian authorities responsible for the site have repeatedly stated that invasive exploration risks damaging the monument, that preservation must take priority over curiosity. This position is understandable. The Sphinx is fragile. Its limestone body has already endured erosion, neglect, and restoration. Any drilling, tunneling, or excavation carries risk. And yet, the restrictions have fueled speculation rather than silenced it, because the technology exists. The anomalies have been identified, and the questions remain unanswered. Why are there voids beneath the Sphinx? Were they carved intentionally? Were they functional? Or are they remnants of something far older, shaped by processes we do not yet fully understand? Some researchers believe these spaces could be natural, the result of fissures or geological variation. Others argue they are artificial, cut with purpose, aligned with meaning. No definitive exploration has resolved the question, and so the voids remain, mapped, measured, and sealed from interpretation. This tension defines the modern Sphinx, not between belief and disbelief, but between curiosity and control, between what can be known and what is permitted to be known. The Sphinx no longer belongs to a single culture. It belongs to the world. And yet, access to its deepest questions is limited, not by lack of technology, but by choice. This is not necessarily concealment. It may be caution. It may be responsibility. Or it may simply be fear of what deeper knowledge would require us to reconsider. Because if the Sphinx hides something tangible beneath it, the implications extend far beyond archaeology. They reach into how we understand history, continuity, and collapse. The Sphinx has survived burial, defacement, reinterpretation, and scientific scrutiny. It has endured myth and measurement alike, and still, it has not surrendered its final questions. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Sphinx was never meant to explain itself. Perhaps it was meant to endure long enough for us to ask better questions. It does not promise answers. It offers silence. And within that silence, possibility. What lies beneath the Sphinx may be nothing more than stone and shadow. Or it may be something else entirely, a remnant, a record, a memory of a time the world no longer remembers clearly. Until those spaces are explored, the Sphinx remains incomplete, not physically, but intellectually. It watches the horizon as it always has, through dynasties, through empires, through revolutions in thought. And it waits, not for belief, but for understanding.